новостях в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути. И он продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome along. It is the evening of the 15th of January, 2026. We are rocketing into the new year like an asteroid heading towards a black hole, leading us through the black hole into potentially a new reality, or just to a fiery, flaming death. But let's be optimistic. Perhaps a new reality, a new balance of forces will emerge, or start to emerge throughout the course of this year. Now, of course, as has been clear if you watch this program for a while, a new balance of forces indeed has been slowly emerging over the course of the last 3 years, arguably over the course of the last 10 years. And what's been happening is, of course, the slow decline of the power of US imperialism from its high point, arguably in the middle 1960s, its brief period of unipolar dominance in the 1990s and 2000s, and now the slow grinding descent into oblivion, which is greeting the administrators of the empire now. Now, we'll get back to the decline and fall, to coin a phrase, of the Western world in the next of our series on the fall of the West. But tonight we're going to be focusing on Iran again and a bit on Venezuela, and talking about, well, why is it that the color revolution machine is looking a little bit shaky these days. Now, starting with Iran, we've discussed this already in a show on this channel and on the Decline and Fall show, but what I'll add to this is that finally it looks like the lessons that were really available to be learned from the DPRK over 30 years ago, or at least 20 years ago, in terms of what was needed to survive in this moment of, like, the supreme moment of neo-colonialism. Now, just to reiterate, what's being done to Iran, economically speaking, over the last, really, well, 40 years, 45 years. Let's just reiterate for the purposes of those who, the understanding of those who perhaps aren't as up to speed on this. Now, as soon as the Islamic Revolution, as it became, started to consolidate itself, the US and the British were caught on the horns of a dilemma. On the one hand, they very much did not want to see the end of the Shah. He had been a very reliable servant for them for quite a number of years. But if they had to choose, as in choose who was going to overthrow him, a government led by religious figures was probably, in their view, a slightly less bad option than a government led by the Iranian communists, which is why, in the early stages, the attitude of the British, at least, was rather cautious towards the emerging Khomeinist government. This, of course, all changed when it became clear that there was radical edges to Khomeinism, which were very much influenced by anti-colonial, anti-imperialist theorists, and also by the growing strength of the Iranian working class. And therefore, the British and the Americans came together, along with the French and the Germans, and of course with assistance, unfortunately, at the time, coming from the Soviet Union, who, of course, was one of Saddam Hussein's key suppliers with weaponry. In fact, the relationship between the Soviet Union and the Iraqi Baathists has got to be one of the worst decisions that the Soviet leadership ever took, given the Iraqi government's predilection for murdering communists en masse, and Saddam Hussein's past and indeed long association with his former handlers in the CIA. But that's perhaps a matter for another video. The Iran-Iraq war was a very serious attempt. In fact, it should be viewed really as something which provides something of a model, really, for the Ukraine war, because the Iran-Iraq war was designed to either destroy completely the Iranian Revolution or damage it to the point where it was unable to pursue its more radical aims. Now, in the second aim, they were arguably successful, but they weren't able to destroy it completely. And Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi Baathists, unfortunately for Iraq, acted as the stooges of the United States in this endeavor. They essentially sold their country to the US and embeggared themselves by taking out gigantic loans, principally from the Saudis, in order to finance a war which they were never going to win, and indeed which ended after almost a decade, around over a million dead, with essentially the Iranian victory came by the survival of the Iranian Revolution and the failure of the Iraqi forces. Iraqi forces which were quartermastered essentially by most of the imperialist bloc, plus the Soviet Union, plus other Eastern Bloc countries. Though it must be emphasized that Iran did receive some assistance from socialist countries. North Korea being the most prominent among these, but also Vietnam. There was also a curious double game being played by both the Soviet Union and the Chinese, who did provide an awful lot of assistance to Saddam Hussein, but also covertly provided assistance to Iran. Indeed, the DPRK was a conduit through which Chinese and Soviet assistance was processed and sent to Iran. There's a fascinating story there, but maybe we'll get into that in more detail in the future. Needless to say, though, the attempt by the US to crush the Iranian Revolution was a very serious and long-lasting one. They provided billions of dollars worth of support to Saddam Hussein, and indeed the Iraqis would not have been able to stand up to the Iranians at all had it not been for the continual loans and equipment and essentially quartermastering of the Iraqi army by the US, the British, the French, the West Germans, the Soviet Union as well, and of course Yugoslavia, which was a big ally of Ba'athist Iraq at the time. Now, there was, of course, the Iran-Contra scandal, but that exists in a slightly different context. But the overwhelming amount of American support went to Iraq, and it went to Iraq to try and use Iraq as a battering ram with which to destroy a threat to American, or what the aspiration for American dominance in the West Asian region. And this was, of course, a decision that was reinforced by the activities of Hezbollah in Lebanon, who emerged allied to the revolutionary Iran, and to this day provide the only real guarantee of any sovereignty of Lebanon, and shall we say, a significant barrier to U.S. domination of the area, which is why they're continually targeted. Now, the point about all of this is that this 8-year campaign to try and destroy the revolution in Iran was ultimately unsuccessful. But it did, of course, lead to the re-emergence of strong capitalist elements in Iran, and comprador elements too, which remain there to this day. The US then goes on to try various different things over the next 20 or so years before we get into the modern period of the intensification of color revolution attempts against Iran. There was various attempts to deal or make a deal with the liberal elements in Iran. I remember the Clinton administration, and even some elements of the George W. Bush administration had some kind of secret contact with the Iranian leadership. This, of course, led to nothing, because the ultimate aim of the Bush administration, or the George W. Bush administration, I should say, was to start a process of regime change operations, beginning with Iraq and Afghanistan, and then ultimately going all the way to Tehran. That is an aim which, again, was not the invention of George W. Bush or Dick Cheney. That's just an objective requirement of U.S. imperialism. But as U.S. imperialism came unstuck in Iraq, and because they received an unacceptable level of casualties, not that many in reality, but a hell of a lot of wounded, and they realized that support for direct occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan was draining away in terms of its political viability in the United States, they, of course, changed tactic again. And the tactic then pursued was that of the color revolution, which I've talked about on numerous occasions, and I've done programs with Kit Klauenberg on it on the Decline and Fall show, so I won't spend too much time talking about that here. But Iran has been a particular target of color revolutions ever since. And of course, the Iranian government has been systematically demonized in the Western world for all the reasons that we've gone into before. And of course, and we'll get to some of the incredibly foolish and reactionary responses from the Western left regarding the latest attempted CIA-led insurrection inside Iran later on in the program. But the mere fact that now, after so many attempts at seizing control or diverting domestic dissent in Iran towards violent and destructive aims, have all come to nothing thus far. And they've come to nothing because ultimately there are very strong elements of the revolution which survive in Iran. The Iranian system, I would argue, is more durable than any of the other systems that the US has gone up against in the entirety of the West Asian region. It's more durable than any of the Ba'athist countries. It's more durable than Gaddafi's state, the Libyan Islamic Jamahiriya, as it was called. And it's more durable because it was born not in, as Iraq, Syria, and Libya, or back in the day, Egypt, were out of an officers' movement or a progressive military coup or something like that. It was born out of the activity of the masses themselves, and it was a revolution that was very, very much bought in the blood and the sacrifice of those that the Iranians refer to as martyrs in the 1980s when they resisted the US imperialist stooge Saddam Hussein and his attempt to destroy them. So hundreds of thousands of Iranians died to defend the country. And many before that had been killed, imprisoned, tortured by the Savak. And this struggle, this harsh struggle against the reactionary Pahlavis regime, against the Western backed Saddam regime, against also a struggle against the sanctions regime, which built up through the 90s and into the 2000s, has been a mass struggle, which involves, of course, the self-activity of the Iranian working class to some extent. In fact, to a much greater extent than any other country in the region. And it is really that which has guaranteed the survival so far of the Iranian system. It is the fact that it was born in a revolution, that there was so many still alive who remember the sacrifice that they had to go through to become a more independent country, to rid themselves of foreign domination. It is that which has prevented the fall of the Iranian system, because the US has tried everything that it possibly can by color revolutions throughout the last 20 plus years to try and bring down the system in Iran. And all of it has not worked. Now, as I've said on numerous occasions, they decided many years ago that a direct frontal assault on Iran would be far too risky. And so they've been trying other more underhanded methods ever since then. The method of sanctions, of course, is one that works as much as it has done, precisely because of the US's ability to exploit the unipolar moment that existed after 1989. And I say after 1989 because after that it was obvious that the Soviet leadership was now the worst enemy of socialism in the entire world, worse than even the US imperialists themselves. So it's from that moment that you get the unipolar moment, and the fact that the US and the British and the French, to a slightly lesser extent, the Dutch and the Germans, were able to build the unipolar system around their banking system. So they were able to build this global neo-colonial system, where the Western banks dominated all transactions and trade, where the dollar became the dominant currency, where this, of course, enabled them to continually virtually print more and more dollars to fund their activities, where they were able to outsource an awful lot of domestic manufacturing, where they were able to rely upon their control of electronic systems of finance and trade to cripple countries, where they were able to use their dominant position in the world, where they were able to use the fact that Wall Street and the City of London are were the centers, still are to a great degree, of global currency trading, where the dollar, the pound, and the euro are really the dominant currencies of the world. And if you control those, and you control the trading centers, and you can freeze countries out of the ability to trade in those currencies, and you control basically the entire international trading system, as they did for quite some time, then you have the ability to starve nations to death with the stroke of a keyboard button, which they've been doing. It's no secret, they've openly boasted about it. As many have pointed out, there's whole papers on how to starve populations into submission. And this is where we come back to the point about the DPRK. The DPRK, under the leadership of first Kim Il-sung, who died in 1994, and then his successor Kim Jong-il, and then his successor Kim Jong-un, though, of course, the DPRK is based upon a foundation, which is the proletarian dictatorship. But the DPRK's leadership realized into the 1990s that unless they were able to